What's up, everyone, and welcome to Creating Great Events, episode 1, where we are talking about how to craft the perfect, and that's in quotes, the perfect event timeline. Now, the reason why it's in quotes is because perfection, especially in the event planning world, is something that is very hard to achieve. There's always going to be, as my mom taught me, she taught me that there is the speech that you plan, the speech that you give, and the speech that you wish that you had given. So I would argue in this, there is the event timeline that you plan, there is the event timeline that you have, and then there's the event timeline that you wish you had post event. So I'm very excited to be talking about this one because obviously as this is powered by the company that I'm building called Event Builder. But we're talking about how to create great events, right? That's the name of the podcast. And so if we're talking about how to craft the perfect event timeline, then what we're really talking about is, what does that mean for us? But then also there's possibly two different types of timelines that you could be thinking about as you go into this, as you think about it in your head. So when I say timeline, it could be that you're thinking about the actual event planning timeline. So what is like the time leading up to the event, and then even after the event, during and after the event. And then what is your, the other side of the coin that you could be thinking about when I say the perfect event planning timeline is you could be thinking about the actual like agenda timeline. So the run of show, the schedule of the event, whatever you want to call it. So those are the two things that I'm actually going to talk about both on this one podcast episode, or both of these. We're going to take a look at event planning timeline and the event agenda timeline. And what does that mean to craft? What is the perfect one? Now, before we even get into either one of those, what we have to talk about is obviously the event agenda, the event planning timeline, whatever that looks like for you. It's all going to depend upon your actual event. And here's what I mean by this is a conference is very different than a wedding, and a wedding is very different than, say, a field day for kids in a school, right? So if we are thinking about getting people together in a conference where they are joining, maybe it's a business conference and they're all coming in, they're employees of your company. It's an all employee, all hands-on conference where everybody's getting together to hear the company mission, vision, values. You go through training, you bring in keynote speakers. Well, that event agenda timeline, the event planning timeline, both of those, all of them are going to be very different than, say, a wedding. A buddy of mine just proposed to his now fiance. They have set a due date or not a due date. That's for, I've got some other friends that are pregnant having kids, but their date for their wedding is going to be taking place in February of 2024. And so planning a wedding looks very different than planning a conference, right? Because you're thinking more about you're thinking, yes, about the energy and the atmosphere and the people. So there are some consistencies between them, but planning a wedding, you're thinking more about it's a celebration, right? You're not bringing in a keynote speaker unless you would consider the officiant the keynote speaker. So it's very different than, say, from the third example, where my daughter is in sixth grade, or not in sixth grade, she's 6 years old. I'm getting tongue-tied even talking about it. Well, my daughter is 6 years old. She's in first grade. And this is not her class that I'm showing on the screen if you're watching the video version of this podcast. But this is a generic, like a photo that I pulled from the internet. Thank you, Canva. And but she is in sixth grade and she does things like this on the field. So it's a picture of a green grass on a green field, and it's a bunch of kids with a couple of teachers, and they are sitting around a parachute. I don't know if you've ever had these at a field day. I used to have them also. But the parachute, like you would stretch it up and down, and you'd run underneath it. You'd put these like the foam dodgeballs on top of it, and you'd pop them around, things like that. So a field day with kids is going to be very different than a conference for adults or a wedding for people of all ages. So the event planning timeline, the event agenda timeline is going to depend upon your event. So let's take a look first at the event planning timeline. So when I've been working on the company Event Builder and the content for that, as well as thinking about this podcast, Creating Great Events, I pulled in this, this is an image on the screen, and I'll describe it to you if you're listening to the podcast version, but it's called the Event Builder Framework. And the event builder framework was built upon this image where I don't know about you, but I grew up in Florida. And whenever I would go to a perfectly still pond, whenever I would go to one, I would look around for something to throw in it because it's just kind of like prime opportunity, right? Why would you not? So what I would do is I would look around and I would say, okay, well, is there a stick? Or there's a pond behind my house. My son loves going back there and he loves throwing sticks in the pond. But imagine you're standing by a still pond. It's perfectly still and you look down at your feet and there's a pile of rocks there. Well, what do you want to do, right? You want to pick it up and you want to throw it in the pond and you want it to make a splash. And so the event builder framework, this process, this step-by-step process that I've designed is just picturing this in your head where your audience, their life, and maybe even your life is like a still pond, and your event that you are planning, your field day or your conference or your wedding or your whatever, you want it to make a splash. You want it to make a difference in the lives. You want it to have ripple effects where you want it to have an impact. Say if you're planning a company conference, you want it to make a splash so that the ripple effects are felt by your business so that your customers are better cared for, so that your employees are more bought into the vision. They're more productive, whether they're salespeople, they sell more, or whatever that means for you. And so that's the event builder framework is we start with the very first step of imagining this rock. We imagine the rock making a splash. And so this is where we're talking about step number one is determining the why behind our event. Or another word for the why is the purpose of our event. And then step number two, if we're planning out our timeline, the very first thing we need to do for our perfect timeline, again in quotes, is picking the purpose, determining the why. Why are we hosting the event? Why do we want this splash to happen? Why do we want this day or this 3-day thing to happen? And then we're creating the actual outline of the day of the event, and we're creating the outline of the agenda, the agenda of the event, yes, but also the outline of like, hey, here's what's happening. If your event is in March and you're sitting in November, what is like the outline of what needs to happen and when? So what's your plan for getting there? And then what's your plan for the day of the event? And then the third thing that you need to do is now that you have those in place, you have an idea of where you want your event to land. So where in the pond do you want to throw that rock? When do you want it to make a splash, which is the date and time of the event? And then you need to think about how to, now that you're throwing your rock and you're getting ready to throw your rock, you need to refine it a little bit. So you need to think about these elements of your event, which are the people involved, as well as, so that's the vendors, that is the AV technicians, that is the people, volunteers helping you plan and produce the event. You need to think about the place where it's going to be held. You need to think about the provisions that you need. So those are the things you need to buy, the things you already have, you need to pack. Things like that. And then what are your promotions for your event? And so you're refining the plan, and then you're preparing for success as the rock is nearing closer to the pond. As you're getting closer to your event day, you are preparing for success, where you're refining the plan even more, where you're starting to gather all the provisions, you're giving last minute instructions. And then finally, when your actual event takes place, you are producing with excellence. When your event happens on event day, you want to follow the plan. You want to trust the process. You want to also trust your gut for any changes and things. So this is how you would plan the leading up to the event with these steps. So determine the why, creating the outline, refining the plan, preparing for success, and producing with excellence. But then you don't want to just stop there, because your event, there's going to be a phase after your event that most people stop with the day of the event, but you really need to think afterwards, where how are you going to reflect and review? And I would even argue that on this reflect and review, it's part of your celebration process. That might be the word that sums up these. A great way to celebrate an event, like if you're planning a wedding and you're the happy couple, you just want to reflect and review while you're celebrating on your honeymoon or in the days and weeks afterwards, right? So that is the process for how to create your perfect event agenda, or not your agenda, but the perfect planning timeline leading up to the event. And now let's actually talk about, well, what does it mean to plan the actual timeline for your event, like the agenda for your event? Well, that timeline again, is going to depend upon the actual event itself. So you need to think about, well, is it a field day or is it a 5K, and have that in mind. But then you need to think about these three different phases of your event for your agenda. And here's what I mean by this is, yes, you're going to have weeks and days and months and maybe even years leading up to your event. But the morning of your event, you need to have a pre-event, like a setup phase, and then you need to have the event is happening phase, so the during event, and then you need to have your post-event phase, which is when the cleanup is happening, and all of that is immediately right there around the production of your event. So during the pre-event phase, you're making sure that the vendors are showing up on time and they're setting up in the catering area, or they're setting up the right cameras and lighting for your conference, or they're making sure that the colors are all matching for your wedding, for the actual, like the table setups, right? And then during the event, you're following your agenda, which is what we're talking about. But this is even before then, we're thinking big picture for our event. So during event is going to be your actual agenda of the event, though. And then post event, you need to be thinking about the cleanup. When are people leaving? How are they leaving? How do they get to their parking if they have parking offsite, and how are you getting them there? And then how are you cleaning up and making sure that you're out of the venue on time and things like that. So those are the three phases of your actual event agenda timeline. And then here's some practical principles for when you start to map that out. So let's say this coming Saturday, as I record this coming Saturday, I'm going to be in Jacksonville, Florida, which is where my wife and I live with our family. And I'm going to be a host and MC and a DJ for a 5K. And so this is very top of mind for me because I'm literally going through this right now. And so I'm thinking about these principles as it comes to the actual 5K. And so the 5K itself, I'm thinking in chunks of time. So if I'm thinking pre-event, I'm thinking, okay, I need 30 minutes here and I need an hour here and it takes me 20 minutes to drive here. So I'm thinking in chunks of time in order to map out my pre-event. My during event, I'm thinking, okay, I need 5 minutes to make these announcements, or I need another 5 minutes to move people to the start and finish line of the 5K. So I'm thinking in chunks of time, and then I'm going to get more granular as I go. But this thinking of chunks in time is really applicable when you're starting to map out your event agenda, the event agenda timeline. And you're saying, hey, what is going to happen? When is it going to happen? How long is it going to take? Who's going to be doing it? Where is it going to be taking place? What do I need to make this happen? All those kinds of things. But it's really helpful to start by thinking in chunks of time. So just think 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 40, 60, things like that. And then another principle when you start to map out this timeline is, of course, stick to your objectives. If your objective as a 5K is you want to, if you have an objective of 5K to raise money, you need to make sure that at least a couple chunks of time is centered around, hey, where do they drop off donations, or where can they buy t-shirts, which fuels the nonprofit side where you're raising money for a certain cause, right? So thinking in chunks of time and building the agenda tied together, especially when you're thinking about how to stick to your objectives for your event. And then the next principle that I have for you with this one is it's really 4 different things tied into one. Number 1 is you need to make sure to center around the objectives, yes, but center around the start and the end times. So thinking in chunks of time, if you have a 6-hour event and you start at 8 a.m. and you say this is going to take 60 minutes, well, now you're already to 9 a.m. and you have that much less time. Make sure to focus upon your key content, right? So what is ancillary, or what is like secondary content, and what is primary, what is key content? So if you're hosting a conference for your employees and you want to train them to be great salespeople, you need to think about that sales training is primary number 1. And then maybe HR and benefits is, while you have them together, you're like, yeah, we could do that while we're here. We don't need to do that while we're here, but we could do that while we're here. So if we have extra time, let's focus first on the training and development, and then the HR and the benefits can be done via Zoom or via an email. Then make sure to think about your different content styles. So if you are planning, again, a conference, You don't want to have keynote after keynote after keynote after keynote after keynote, and it just runs where they're just sitting the whole time. You want to keep people engaged with your event, where they are paying attention to your event and not their cell phone. What you want to do is you want to make sure to mix up those styles of content throughout your event agenda. So have a panel and then a keynote and then have a Q&A session and then have a game or an activity. So mix up the content. That's all, again, tied to your objectives. And then the final and fourth thing, bullet point that I've got under these principles is to consider the actual logistics when you're thinking through those three phases, when you're thinking through your objectives, and when you're mapping it out. So if you have keynote, and then you have 4 breakout rooms that you're sending people to. Logistically, you need to think, well, I need a 5-minute chunk of time to get everybody out of the room and into the breakout room. And then when they're done at breakout rooms, logistically, I need to think about, okay, I need time to get them back in. I need another 5 minutes to give them to go to the bathroom, and maybe another 5 minutes for them to either check email or to get a snack out in the hallway. And then you need to make sure that while you're preparing for the snacks in the hallway, what are you feeding them and where are they getting it from? Is it going to bottleneck? Making sure you have enough for everybody, all those kinds of things. So again, make sure to stick to your objectives, stick to those 4 things. And then finally, to wrap up this episode of Creating Great Events, I'm coming back to the quote unquote perfect timeline and how it depends upon your event. So the perfect timeline is an illusion, right? I mentioned at the beginning that there's going to be the timeline that you plan. There's going to be the timeline that you have for your actual event. And then when you reflect and review, you are going to have the timeline that you wish that you had beforehand, where you're like, oh, if I could go back and do this over again, I wish that I had given myself more time for X to plan this one element, or I wish that I had given this one speaker more time because the audience, they were just so enraptured. Or if it's your wedding, I wish that I had given myself more time to pick the right photographer, right? So regardless of what it is, there's going to be an illusion of the perfect event timeline, whether that's the planning one leading up to it or the agenda for the day of. So when you think about it, think about, okay, perfection is an illusion. It's not something we're ever going to reach, but it's still something we can strive for. So here's a very practical way to bring this home is when you start to plan your event, ask yourself and ask your planning team and ask other people this question: what does the perfect blank look like? What does the perfect meal look like? What does the perfect talk look like? What does the perfect panel look like? What does the perfect vendor village at my 5K look like? What does that perfection look like? And then just start from there and make sure to keep all of these things in mind. Well, if this was helpful for you, I'd be so honored if you left a review. And if you enjoy the video version, I've had graphics on the screen pretty much the whole time. So if you're listening to this, be sure to subscribe and follow, and then you can check out the video version on YouTube and on Spotify as well. Thanks everyone, and we'll see you in another episode of Creating Great Events. See ya.